Welcome back to Football Happy Hour on CBS Sports HQ. I'm Jenny Dell, and it has been months of buildup. We finally made it draft day for the first time. The NFL draft will be held in Las Vegas, Nevada, where our all-star crew awaits. We got Rick Spielman, Pete Prisco, Ryan Wilson, and Bryant McFadden. Welcome on in, fellas. Now, we are just a few hours away from the NFL draft, and it figures to be one of the most unpredictable in recent memory. At this point, do you think the Jags know exactly who they are going to pick first overall? Or do you think they're still a little bit torn? Now, Rick, I want to start with you. From your experience, what ends up being the outcome? Who do you think they will end up selecting? And then I want to hear the fellas' take as well.
Yeah, well, right now, I think Jacksonville is having meetings with the ownership, with the head coach, and with Trent Baalke, their GM. And they have pretty much three options, although I disagreed with Pete earlier in the day that they're going to take an offensive tackle. I think it's going to come down to one of the two defensive ends. You got Adrian Hutchinson, who is probably the safest pick, but you got a Trayvon Walker, who wasn't as productive in college, but he has a tremendous upside with his unique physical traits. So I'm sure they're going back and forth with that. They're talking with the owner, but they are right now probably finalizing, if they haven't already, who they're going to take with the number one overall pick.
It is sort of crazy that they don't know what it feels like the 11th hour. And, Rick, I'll just ask you a question, and then, B-Mac, you can follow with what you want to say. But how can you not know, number one? And number two, if you've drafted an edge rusher in the first round in 2 of the last 3 years and you haven't won a lot of football games, why would you go back to that well?
I think just because that's the way the draft is this year, and those are the top players in the draft. And, you know, we talked about earlier, there's not a franchise quarterback, and they were able to get that last year. So if they think that one of these defensive ends to team up with Allen on the other side, because pass rush is so critical in today's NFL. So you have to take the best player available, and you can't miss on that number one overall pick.
For me, when I look at the draft this year, I think this is the wrong year to have the number one pick, because
that's why no one's going to trade up to go get the number one overall
pick. There's no clear-cut guy that we all believe is the best player in this draft. And then when you look at the Jacksonville Jaguars and their connection to Trayvon Walker, if you were to rank the draftable players on Georgia's defense at the end of the college football regular season, it's safe to say Walker will be ranked dead last. So, Rick, for the question for you, how do you assess a player that wasn't very, very productive, but then he opened so many eyes at the combine to the standpoint that you believe that he should potentially go number one?
What is actually happening in these meetings? You got a kid that's 6'5 plus. He's 277 pounds. He ran a 4.51. We had the same discussions with Danielle Hunter, but Danielle Hunter was a third-round pick. It wasn't the first overall round pick. But you have to talk with your coaches, and the coach is going to say, because of how they played him, because they slid him inside on a lot of the nickel pass rush situations, he's raw as an outside edge rusher. He's going to have to learn pass rush moves and nuances, but I can't teach that arm length. I can't teach that height, weight, speed. So me as a coach, if the GM's saying, if we're going to take this guy, you as a coach, it's going to be on you. If you're signing off as well, we have to do the best we can as the organization that is drafting him to make him as successful as he can be.
I had a hard time with a player comp for him. I went through a bunch of guys. Somebody in the league mentioned Justin Smith, used to play for the 49ers. I came away with Michael Bennett. And Michael Bennett was a big end, power end, could move inside and play. Wasn't a pure speed pass rusher, but was a darn good pass rusher. If you could get Michael Bennett in his career 1 overall, would you take that? No. That's tough to answer that question. You probably say no. I'm going the other way. I would take the offensive lineman. I think Jacksonville has decided. Trent Baalke was on a radio show just a couple minutes ago, and he said earlier they made their decision last night whether it's going to be Walker or one of the offensive linemen. Again, I told you earlier, Doug Peterson, one of the offensive linemen. He wants to build that thing around the quarterback. Trent Baalke wants the pass rusher, so we'll see which way it goes.
And I agree with Pete. I think the best position to attack at 1 for Jacksonville is the offensive line spot. Now, seeing Cam Robinson get that extension, it seems like he's that long-term answer.
Right tackle.
At the left, and then potentially if you get a guy on the offensive side, he has to play the right side. And for me, the final knock on Trayvon Walker to Jacksonville, scheme. right? If you look at their rushers, they got Josh and Kaylavon Chasen, two guys that are outside rushers. If you draft Trayvon Walker, now you're telling me he has to be productive, basically playing the 3 technique. And I don't know if he can be the best football player that he can be playing inside like that. And the same can be said for Aiden Hutchinson. You don't draft Aiden Hutchinson to have him playing inside. He does all of his damage as a perimeter edge rusher. But Jacksonville, they have to answer those questions already on their defense with Allen and Chason as edge rushers.
Yeah, and Walker is the favorite, the odds-on favorite right now to go number 1 to the Jags. So we'll find out soon enough, fellas. All right, now we have 4 teams that will have a new GM for this draft. 9 teams will have a new coach. In that first draft, what kind of risks do you think these guys are going to take? Rick, we'll start with you here. What is the mood like in the war room, like especially on your first draft night?
I remember my first draft with the Minnesota Vikings, and you want to make sure to make an impression on your first draft that you're running that you hit that first-round pick, and you're going to take the surest, safest player. And for us, we were very fortunate that Adrian Peterson fell to us. So it was a no-brainer for us, and I was very fortunate that we had the ability to select him where we were able to select him in that draft. But I think until a new general manager kind of builds his reputation in the draft, that, you know, you can afford a miss here or there. But I think the first draft, you want to make sure you take the best player that's the safest player, the best player that loves football, but also is a high character, high quality type person.
I love that you mentioned that because I'm immediately going to the Raiders, who traded for Devontae Adams, who feels like the safest player in this draft class if you're making that move. Would you feel comfortable in year 1, a few months on the job, trading a first-round pick for a player of the caliber of Devontae Adams?
Well, there's very rarely do you ever get a chance to get. It's like I remember when early in my career in Minnesota, we had the opportunity to go trade for a Jared Allen. And Jared Allen ended up being, you know, there was some questions about his character, and he was basically a long snapper coming out and ended up being a pretty good defensive end, but he became one of, in my opinion, along with the foursome or the Purple Peeper Eaters, one of the best defensive ends and one of the best defensive linemen in Minnesota history.
Yeah. Rick, who has more pressure on them in a first draft? A first-year head coach or a first-year GM?
I think it depends on how the structure is, and each organizational structure is different. But if they're telling you that the GM has the final say, then I'd always make sure before I'm going to make that selection that the head coach is totally on board with me, because I never believed that I would draft a player that a head coach couldn't really sign off on in the first round, because as professional as all these coaches are, I want them to be just as vested in that player as I am to make sure we give him the best chance to have success.
Here's a couple things about new coaches and new staffs. You can't miss your first round picks.
Yeah.
You know, and I go back to when Tom Coughlin, I was covering him back in the day, started the Jaguars. He didn't miss his first round picks. He missed a bunch of other ones, but he didn't miss his first round picks. And so once you miss one, you know what happens? You play the chasing game. If you miss a corner, then you're going to be chasing that down the road. And once you start doing that, it really impacts the rest of your football team. So the advice for all of them: don't miss your first round pick.
Easier said than done, Pete.
Well, it's only football, B-Mac. It's just football.
It's just football. It would be so interesting to be a fly on the wall in some of those situations. All right, guys, we're going to talk about the Jets next. They are linked to trading number 10 overall for Deebo Samuel. So do you think that is worth it? Rick, as a former GM, how early before the draft do you want this deal, something of this caliber, to go down? Can this really happen as the clock is winding down tonight?
I would find it extremely, very rarely, highly unlikely. And the reason why is if you're trading with a team with this caliber of player that's going to also involve probably a contract, but I would not ever trade for a player unless I brought him into the facility and gave him a physical. And a lot of times in trades, when you turn in the trade papers to the league and you're working with the other team, the number one thing is he has to pass a physical before that trade becomes complete. So it's impossible to fly Deebo to wherever he's going to go, any potential to trade with the Jets, get a physical by in a couple hours, and then get a trade done.
So let's say clean bill of health. Would you take Deebo 10? trade for that?
I'm
Clean
sorry?
bill of health on Deebo. Did you make that?
Yeah,
trade
but
too?
I'm not going to do that until I know the team doctor has signed off on it.
Right. I think, assuming that Deebo Samuel's healthy, and Pete, I think you disagree with me, that's fine. I would trade as the Jets the 10th overall pick for Deebo Samuel. They were all in on Tyreek, and they're willing to pay Tyreek. They'll be willing to pay Deebo Samuel, not Tyreek money, but he makes that football team better. And you don't know what you're going to get at 10 because the guy you might like may not be there. So
well,
that's the
they
only
didn't
reason.
know what they were getting with Deebo Samuel. They drafted him in the second round. Devontae Adams comes in the second round. Look at these. Tyreek Hill later in the draft. You can find receivers. They're all over the place. I'm not trading and paying. And you talk about Tyreek Hill, and I love Tyreek Hill. Nobody does what he does. That changes the game.
He's not going to make Tyreek money, though.
Huh? But he's going to make $24-25 million a year if you trade him.
But Pete, we're talking about the New York Jets. Their fans been living in a thunderstorm for 10 plus years. Give them some sunlight. Whoever you can draft at 10 will not be the player that Deebo
Not
is
right away,
this
won't be.
year. And Deebo's going into his fourth
Not
year.
right away.
It's
won't
not like
be.
he's in year
How do you
7
know
or
Garrett
8.
Wilson won't be that player?
I'm just.
That's
I'm going
and
off what we
cheaper.
know.
And
That's
cheaper.
the unknown, Pete. We have yet to see Garrett Wilson score a touchdown in the National Football League. But one thing we know, Deebo has already established himself as a made man at the quarterback
Deebo's
position.
a proven commodity.
Proven.
No
Yes.
doubt.
And the
No
unknown.
doubt, but he's
I
also
would not
expensive.
make that trade
No, willing to
until
pay it.
after the draft if they're going to do it.
I'm not making it, period.
Because if he comes in and flunks a physical or something goes wrong and you traded that pick, what did you get? You don't get the player, and you don't get the 10th round pick.
And that makes sense, but given everything as well health-wise, 10 for Deebo, I'll do it, and pay him. You're not
Look
paying
at all
your
these
quarterback.
guys all these guys that were traded or complaining about money. What rounds did they come in? A.J. Brown, Terry McLaurin.
We're talking
they're all
about
later
an
round
organization that has been a lifetime
Money.
movie for such a long time.
Yeah.
Their fans been crying year in and year out. Give them something to be hopeful for, and do it.
Get a cheap wide receiver who can do a lot of the same.
And you're going to keep that thunderstorm over your head with no hair.
Cloudy, too.
Preach, B-Mac. Preach out there. You're talking about 10 plus years. The Jets missed the playoffs for the 11th straight year last season. So they're hoping something goes down tonight.
Do you want a sports network that delivers everything that matters about the game? The highlights, the picks, the instant analysis. No yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.